Masechet Ketubot Daf Non Tet. The Mishnah was talking about a husband who sanctifies his wife's earnings. With regard to the base amount of her earnings, which is equivalent to her food, she owns that because she can say, keep your food, and I'm going to keep my earnings. So according to Rav Huna in the name of Rav, that Hekdesh does not work because she has a right to keep it. However, regarding the added amount, what she makes in surplus of the base amount, the minimum that she needs to make, there we saw a machloket according to the Meir. It does work, and the husband has a right to it. Therefore, he has a right to consecrate it. That we talked about yesterday, whether that's talking about after her death or not. The other opinion was that of Rabbi Yochanan Hasandlar, who says that it does not work if a man says your earnings, the surplus earnings, are going to be consecrated. They are not consecrated at all. Now, Rabbi Yochanan Hasandlar does not give a reason in the Mishnah, but the Gemara is going to assume that the reason is because he thinks one cannot consecrate something that is not yet in the world. We're talking about her future earnings. She didn't make it yet, so you can't consecrate something that doesn't actually exist. And so therefore, Amar Shemuel, Halakha Rabbi Yochanan Hasandlar, Shemuel, according to this, seems to agree that one cannot sanctify something that does not yet exist in the world. All right, Shemuel said that halacha. However, we have a contradiction. We Amar Shemuel hachi v'hatenan. A Mishnah in Nedarim says, Konam she'ani osa lepicha. If a woman makes a vow, this is a konam. Konam is a short form for korban. People didn't always want to say that this is going to be prohibited like a korban, because that's like a very serious phrase. So they would use nicknames, alternate words. So kanam is one of those. So anyone can say any item is going to be like a korban and therefore forbidden, and one can do it forbidden to oneself, or if something I own, I can make it forbidden to you. So if a wife says konam shani oseh leficha, what I prohibit anything that I make for you, so you cannot, for your mouth, meaning anything that I earn, anything that I do, is prohibited to you like a korban. If a wife does that, what's the consequences? Tanakama says, "Eno sarich lehafer." Tanakama says this does not take effect, and the husband does not even have to nullify that vow, because she is already obligated from the time of the marriage that she has to do certain things for her husband. The next Mishnah on Amud Bet is going to list all the items that wife is responsible to do in the marriage. So since she is already obligated to that, she does not have the right or ability to prohibit those things upon him. And so the vow is null and void even without him having to say so. Rabbi Akiva omed yafer, shema ta'adif alav yatem min hara'oi. Rabbi Akiva, however, says that the husband does need to nullify it, not because of the base amount, that he agrees that is pre-nullified, because she is already obligated to do that. But what if she makes more than the minimum, and that surplus then is something that he will no longer be able to have benefit from, and that'll be a problem. So he should therefore nullify the entire vow, so that he will be able to benefit from any surplus that she makes. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Amar Yafer Shema Yigareshena Ote Asura Lachazor. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says he should nullify it, but for a different reason, because in the future they may get divorced, and if after they get divorced they may change their minds and want to remarry. As long as it's not a kohen, that's totally fine. Here's the problem. If she makes a vow right now that anything that she does will be prohibited to him, even though it will not take effect right now, because as Tanakama and Rabbi Akiva say, it will not take effect on any base amount, even though it doesn't take effect now, once they get divorced, then she gets her life back, she gets her earnings, the right to her earnings back, and at that point, later on, the vow will take effect. Once that vow takes effect and she cannot do anything for him, that will make it impossible for them to remarry, because There's no way to be married and not have her benefit him in some way. Everything she does around the house is going to benefit him, and so they would be impossible for them to get married. So although right is true for the duration of this marriage, there wouldn't be a problem. So in that sense, he's agreeing with Tanakama that he doesn't have to undo it for now, but he will have to do it for later. Okay, now that is a different Mishnah. Regarding that Mishnah, V'amar Shemuel halacha keRabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Shemuel said halacha is like this Rabbi Yochanan. Don't get confused. Up here we're talking about Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlad is in our Mishnah. This Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in the Mishnah in Nedarim. And over there we're talking about her future earnings, not even just in the future now, in the future after she gets divorced and they get remarried, after they get divorced, those future earnings will be prohibited to him, whether they get remarried or not. So you see, according to this, Shemuel thinks that one can consecrate some and prohibit it to her husband, something that does not yet exist in the world. And so we have a contradiction. In the Mishnah in Ketubot, he said halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, that if the husband tries to make her added earnings prohibited, it doesn't work because it does not exist in the world. And here he says halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who says that the prohibition, the vow will take effect in the future for her earnings that she gets should they get divorced, after they get divorced. So that's the challenge. We're going to see a few different answers to this question. Our first answer is that when he said halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri over here in this case, he didn't mean totally that it's like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri would say that the entire vow takes effect once they get divorced. But he only agreed with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri regarding the surplus added to what she already added to the base amount. By this, he means the surplus amount that she is currently making, not talking about after divorce, but the current one, which is so therefore not something that will come into the world. Okay, the truth is that it's still talking about her future earnings, not far future divorce, but future earnings that she will earn tomorrow. So it's still something that is going to be the future. So it's not really a great answer, but we're going to reject it from yet another, even better challenge to this. Yochanan ben Nuri ha'adafa. Ina me en halacha k'tanakama. Ina me halacha k'Rabbi Akiva. If Shemuel really meant to only agree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, not regarding after divorce, but rather the surplus now, he either should have said that explicitly, ha'adafa, or he could have said halacha is not like Tanakama. Tanakama said he does not have to annul it. He could have said that's not the halacha, he should annul it. Or he could have said halacha, the best would be halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, because really, in effect, all he's saying is that I agree with Rabbi Akiva that he should annul it now because of the surplus amount that she is making now, that she is not pre-obligated to give him, and therefore she does own that and would have a right to keep that from him, and that's why he should annul it for the surplus amount. So that's exactly what Rabbi Akiva said. So it would make no sense for Shemuel to say halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but only regarding hadafa, not because of the future after divorce. Well, don't say that. Don't say halacha like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Say halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. So we reject that answer and bring a second answer to resolve the contradiction between two statements of Shemuel. Ela amar Rav Yosef, kunamot kamar shane konamot mitoch she'adam oser perot chavero alav, adam makdish davar shelo ba la'olam. The Mishnah in Masechet Nedarim here is talking about kunamot, which is different from sanctifying hekdesh, sanctifying something to the Bet HaMikdash. When someone says a kunam, that has more flexibility, more applicability. For example, a person can say that person's fruit that belongs to him is prohibited to me, right? I can say that, even though I don't own it, but I'm making it prohibited to myself. that is, you can do with a kunam. Whereas for hekdesh, I cannot mi magdish to the Bet HaMikdash someone else's produce. If I don't own it, I can't make it prohibited to everyone like a korban. But I can do the more limited thing of make it prohibited to myself, even though I don't own it. So too, adam makdish davar shelo ba'al ha'olam, someone can also use the kunam formula for something that does not yet exist in the world. Just like it works for something that I don't own, so too it works for something that doesn't even exist. The future earnings will be prohibited to me. That one can say, even though one could not say hekdesh to something that doesn't exist in the world. Okay, good. So this resolves Shemuel over there in the Mishnah in Nedarim was talking about kunam. Where you can do that to something that doesn't exist in the world, whereas the one Mishnah here in Ketubot is talking about hekdesh, which you cannot do to something that doesn't exist in the world. That's Rav Yosef's answer, but we're going to challenge it. Amar le'Abaye, Bishlama Adam oser perot chavero alav, sheken Adam oser perotav al chavero. Your analogy is not correct. Right, I understand. It does make sense. Yes, a person can prohibit his friend's fruit upon himself. That's fine. Just like a person can prohibit his own fruit upon his friend. This is my fruit, and I prohibit you to take part of it. So either it's on yourself or it's something you own that on someone else. Both of those are fine, but that's not the same as our case. Yesor davar shelo ba'al ha'olam al chavero, sheken en adam oseh parot chavero al chavero. But to make something prohibited that doesn't exist in the world, that would be the same as a person prohibiting one person's fruit upon another person, both not him. In other words, a person cannot do that even with the konam formula. I have to either be the person being prohibited or I have to own the fruit. I cannot say that Mr. A's fruit is prohibited to Mr. B, and that would be equivalent to prohibiting something that doesn't even exist in the world, has nothing to latch onto. And so, therefore, a woman too here, in this case, a woman cannot say that my future earnings are going to be prohibited to my husband. This is something that she doesn't own, because it's in the future. She doesn't own it now, and she's prohibiting it upon someone else. If she was prohibiting it on herself, okay, my future earnings are prohibited to me, okay, but she can't prohibit it to someone else. That would be the same as prohibiting one thing, Mr. A against Mr. B. So Ela Amar Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua. So another answer to resolve this. Be'omeret yikadeshu yadai le'osehem de'adayim itnehu ba'olam. Mishnah is talking about where she says, my hands are consecrated to the one who made them. By this, what the Gemara really means is that because she's not making it prohibited to everyone, she's making it prohibited only to her husband. But this is removing it from davar shelo ba'al ha'olam, since she's making her hands prohibited to her husband with a kunam. These are kunam, my hands, and therefore anything they produce will be prohibited to you. So their hands are something that she owns. They're hers. They're attached to her. And therefore, it works to say, kunam, my hands to you, is something that can take effect, and it's not really something that is talking about the future. Whereas, so that's our Mishnah in Nedarim. The Mishnah in Ketubot is when she doesn't use that formula. She said, but rather he says your future earnings will be prohibited. Well, that's not something that doesn't exist in the world. Okay. Hold on. Even in that case, when she says my hands are kunam prohibited to you, does that work? Even her hands are subjugated under they're given over under her husband's authority. When they get married, he has a right to whatever her hands produce. So he has a right to her hands, effectively. I guess you could translate hands as her potential earnings. She are already subjugated to him, and therefore she doesn't even have a right to do that. So the answer is Damra lechi megadesha. We're talking about when she says, when we get divorced, then my hands will be my earnings will become a kunam. It can't be now because right now they're already subjugated to him. But when she gets divorced, then she'll have them back. So she's making a kunam for the future. That's where it's possible to do. Okay, but even that we challenge. Is do we ever find a case where something right now is not consecrated and it can't be consecrated, but in the future, when something happens, it'll trigger an event and then it will be consecrated? We never find such a thing like that. Right, that you would say right now she doesn't have a right to consecrate her hands, kunam, but then in the future it will happen automatically. So Amar bi Ilai alamalo. He says, why not? I own a field and I'm going to sell it to you, but I plan on buying it back one day. Maybe I just need the cash now, but I'll buy it back. So if I say this land that I'm selling to you, when one day I buy it back, it will be hekdesh. Mila kadsha, that should work, because after all, I'm not making something hekdesh that you own, but rather something that I own. I own it now. Even though I'm not making hekdesh now, I'm saying that when I buy it back, then it will be hekdesh. So actually, it is possible to make something hekdesh that not now, and something later on will trigger it. So what's the problem? Matkifla says, no, it's no good. It's not the same as the woman. In that case, the field, it's in my property right now, so I can make it hekdesh, and I can say it'll trigger in the future when I buy it back. But in the case of the woman, she does not have a right to divorce herself. A man has to initiate a divorce. If she wants a divorce, she can't just decide to do it. It's not like a land where it's under my control. I can decide to sell it or not sell it. So, rather, the case of the woman is more like a case where I sold you a field already, and then I say, that field that I already sold you, when I buy it back, it will be hekdesh. That doesn't work, because I can't make something hekdesh that doesn't belong to me, and right now it belongs to you. This is the same as the woman. When she was single, she owned herself. Then she could have made any vow she wanted. But once she got married, she has already given over the authority of her earnings, the subjugation of her earnings to her husband. And so she can't say, when we get divorced, it wouldn't work. Matkifla the papa objects to that and says, Mi dameh. No, that's also not the same. Hatam gufa uperot biada delokeach. In the case of this analogy, if I sold you a field, at that point you own the field and you own everything it will produce. Whereas whereas for the wife, her body is in her possession. She owns her hands, even if the husband owns the produce to the hands. So actually, the case of the woman is better. And yes, true. In that case, he cannot make it hekdesh. But in this case, since she owns her hands now, then she should be able to say, when I get divorced and I get my produce, the rights to my produce back, the rights to my hands, then it will be hekdesh. Maybe it should work. שדה זו שמשכנתי לך, לכשאפדנה ממך תקדש, תקדשה. Rather, the case of the woman is like a case of someone says, I own this field, I mortgaged it to you. I needed some cash, so you are now using the field, kind of borrowing it and using its produce. But anytime I want, I can always redeem it, right? I can always pay down the mortgage and take back the field. So since I own it now, even though I'm renting it out, I can say this, and that hekdesh works. That is the same as this case, where right now the woman owns her own body. She's kind of like renting it out to her husband during the duration of the marriage. But here too, she should be able to say, when we get divorced, then I'll get the rights to my earnings back. but we're not happy with this either. Matkif la Rav Shisha b'ded Rav Idi midame hatam biyado liftota. In that case of the mortgage, the owner of the land can redeem it anytime he wants. Hacha en biyada legaresh asma, but she cannot take it back. Even though she owns her body, she doesn't have access to take back the right to her earnings. Okay, rather, this is more like someone who says to his friend, this land is mortgaged to you for 10 years, so he cannot take it back at any time. He has to wait 10 years. But when I take it back, when I redeem it in 10 years, then it will be hekdesh. And in that case, the hekdesh works. So the wife is the same as that. It's true, she has no right to divorce herself now, but in the future, should she get divorced, it should work. But again, we challenge this. Matkif la Rav Asher, mida mehatam le'eser shanim miha biyado liftota, hacha en biyado legaresh asma le'olam. In that case, yeah, there's a definite cutoff point. In 10 years, he can get his land back. So yes, it could work for the future. But in this case, she never has the right to demand a divorce. And so it's never in her hands. And therefore, since it's not a sure thing that is under her control ever, therefore, she has less of a possibility, less of a right to make hekdesh, something that will only happen in the future to get back the right of earning. It's true, she owns her hands, but the right of earning is under her husband's authority until the husband decides to divorce and let it back, and she has no power over that. So this whole answer that we've been trying this whole time, that dissolves, and we have a final answer. Ela amar Rav Asher kunamot ka'amart, shane kunamot iktushat haguf ninhu uchterava. You're talking about kunamot. Kunamot are fundamentally different than anything that's hekdesh, because kunamot are kedushat haguf. There's two kinds of kedusha. Kedushat mamon. If I donate myself to the Bet HaMikdash, I don't become holy, but rather I redeem my value and pay the money. That's what hekdesh means. But kedushat haguf is like a korban. If I say this sheep is a korban, I can't redeem it for another. It itself becomes holy, and that's the same thing with a kunam. The item itself becomes sanctified, becomes prohibited to that person. Uchderava, damarava, hekdesh chames, v'shichrur, mafkirin mideh shi'bud. And Rava is based on Rava, who said that if I have some item that is a lien it's a guarantee on a loan, a watch or something, and I make it hekdesh, it's no longer a lien to that other person. Usually, if I would just sell it or donate it, its monetary value, then it would still have a prior lien to the person that I gave it to. But if I make it hekdesh as a kunam in and of itself, then the lien is gone, because it no longer has monetary value, because it has to be given over to it in itself has to be given over to the Bet HaMikdash. So too, chametz, if I have a loan, I borrowed money, and this chametz that I own, it has a lien on it from to the lender, and then Pesach starts, so now the chametz has no value, because it cannot be eaten, it cannot be owned, no benefit can come from it. Since it has zero value, so there's no longer a lien on it. So to shichrur, if I own a slave and I use a slave as a guarantee on a loan, and then I free the slave, I don't own the slave anymore. So the slave, the lien is removed. Mafkin mideh shi'abud. The application here is that when she says, my hands are kunam to you, my husband, that takes effect even though he has a prior right to the earnings of her hands from the time that they're married, even though he has a lien on the hands. Nevertheless, because she uses a language of kunam, that gives it inherent sanctity, and therefore its value and the lien leave, as Rava said. So that would apply to here too. Okay, so that's why the kunam works even though it's something that does not yet exist in the world, because these are her future earnings, but she is making her hands hekdesh, and even though her hands are rented out to her husband, or lien to her husband, it doesn't matter. The kunam can undo the lien. Good. Last question. If so, then her kunam can take effect as soon as she says it. Why Shemuel says halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who's worried that after the divorce, at that point, then she will get her hands back, and they won't be able to get remarried. The kunam works from the lien even now, and the answer is al muhar abanan l'shibudeh de baal ki hechi delati kadesh mehashta. Says you're right. Technically, it could leave now, but the rabbis reinforced the lien of the husband on her hands because they wanted to strengthen that institution, because that's a basic thing in the marriage relationship and their mutual responsibilities. And so the rabbi said, you know what, we're going to say that it's not, the hekdesh does not work from now, but only at the end of the marriage, only should he get divorced. So in effect, it's not really something that is davar shelo bala olam, because her hands do exist now, and her hands, even though she rented them out or gave a lien on them, nevertheless, using the word kunam, she can get them back. The rabbis say, we're not going to let you have them back now during the marriage, because that'll ruin the marriage, but you can have them back at the end. But Shemuel is consistent. He does not think that you can sanctify something that is not yet in the world if you only use the language of hekdesh. He doesn't think you can sanctify something that's not in the world at all. And if you're only saying the language of hekdesh, then it does not work at all, because that will only affect something in the future. Whereas if she uses the language of kunam, and which she talks about her hands, if you have both of those things, then kunam has the power to apply it to her hands currently, even though they have a lien on them. All right, next Mishnah. The following are the chores, the tasks that a wife is obligated to do for her husband. He has his obligations, he has to feed her and so on, other things, and this is her obligations. Tochenet, she has to grind the wheat into flour. Ofa, she has to bake into bread. Mechabeset mevashelet, she has to wash clothes and cook. Menikat bena, nurse her children. Masat lotamita, make her husband's bed. Veosa basemed, and spin wool. 7 items that are her domain, her responsibility. Hichnisa lo shivcha achat. Now, one way she can get out of it is if she brings a maidservant into the marriage. Her father gave her a maidservant, maybe part of the dowry. She brings a maidservant into it. Lo tochenet v'lo ofa v'lo mechabeset. Then she can offload those 3, outsource those 3 items of grinding, baking, and washing. Those are labor intensive. Those are the first things that she will give to the maidservant. Shetayim, if she brings 2 maidservants, they're wealthy and they can afford that. And mevashelet ve'menikat bena, then she doesn't need to cook and she does not need to nurse her children. That maidservant will act as a wet nurse. Shalosh and masat lo amitav. She brings 3 into the marriage, then she doesn't even have to make the bed. Ben osaba semed, and she doesn't have to spin wool at all. And arba yoshebet bekatedra. If she has 4 maidservants, then she does not have to do anything at all. She can sit in a cathedral chair. Katedra is Greek, same from the root of cathedral. It means she can sit in a big throne like a queen, and the maidservants do all the work. So these tasks need to be done. And if there's no maidservant, she has to do them. But she can, if she can afford and brings these maidservants into the marriage, she can have them do it, and therefore she will not have to do anything. Rabbi Eliezer אומר, אפילו הכניסה לו 100 שפחות כופה לעשות בסמר שהבטלה מביאה לידי זימה. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and says, even if she has 100 maidservants, we will force her, the husband can force her to spin the wool, because idleness leads to promiscuity. It's not good for a person to sit and do nothing. They're just going to find negative things to take their time. So she should do something. In other words, work is valuable in and of itself, not just because there's no one else to do it. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Af hamadir et ishto mila'asot melacha, Yosiv yiten ketubah shebatala mebi'ad lidei shi'mum. And similarly, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if someone prohibits his wife, he makes a vow that his wife cannot do any work, in that case, he has to divorce her, even though he doesn't care, and so he'll have other servants to do all the work. But there's a problem, because she won't be able to do work, because anything she does is going to benefit him, and she is now prohibited from doing anything. And so if she remains married, she's going to be idle, and idleness leads to boredom, leads to just wasting away, and therefore a person should not do that. So we have here kind of really interesting machloket and insight into work. On the one hand, work needs to be done to take care of the children, take care of the family, the household, but there's a positive value in keeping oneself busy in and of itself. Okay, tochenet salkat da'atach. Now, when it says she has to grind, does that mean she has to physically do the grinding herself? Usually people use either a watermill or animals to turn these big grinders. So we know that we have experts that are doing this. So she wouldn't have to sit herself and grind. Ela ema matchenet. Rather, it means that she has the things ground. She will bring the flour to the grinding place and supervise it and take care of it. That's her responsibility. Or it could be talking about a hand mill. If you only need a little bit at a time, then you can use a hand mill. It's work and doesn't produce that much, but it could be talking about that. If she has a lot, she'll take it to the watermill. If she has a little, she'll do the hand grinding. Matnitin de lo Rabbi Chiya. Now this Mishnah in its entirety disagrees with Rabbi Chiya, the Tana Rabbi Chiya. En isha ela leyofi. He says that a wife is only for beauty. En isha ela lebanim. A wife is only for children, and therefore she should not be doing household tasks and chores. She should just sit there and be beautiful and have children. Similarly, another baraita, he says, "En isha ela letachshite isha." A woman is there only for jewelry. She should sit there and just wear jewelry. He also gives other advice. If you want your wife to look beautiful, then let her wear linen garments. And independent advice, if someone wants his daughter to look white. White was considered beautiful, rich, luxurious. When people had to work, then they're out in the field, they get dark, or they're working with dirty things. So this would be a sign of a high class. So if you want her skin to be more fair, then you should feed your daughter young chickens and milk at the time of her maturity. I guess those are both white things, so you are what you eat, and therefore one will become more white. All right, so that's Rabbi Chiya disagrees with the Mishnah, and therefore a wife should not have to do anything. All right, someone out there can do a feminist reading of this to see which is more or less a feminist, making her do all these chores, or not making her do all these chores. You can let me know what you think. Okay, menika et bena, regarding the obligation for her to nurse her children. Lema matnitin de lo ke Bet Shammai. It seems that this Mishnah disagrees with Bet Shammai. Detanya nadra shelo lahanik et bena. If a woman makes a vow, I'm not nursing Bet Shammai, my children. Bet Shammai omrim shometet dad mipi. Bet Shammai says she has to stop nursing, and that's it. They remain married, and she doesn't nurse. In other words, Bet Shammai says it's not a fundamental obligation of the marriage that she has to nurse her children. If she doesn't want to, then she doesn't. Bet Hillel omrim kofa umenikato. Bet Hillel says he can force her to nurse, because Bet Hillel would say this is a basic obligation of the marriage, and therefore she has no right to vow not to do so. Nitkarsha eno kofeh. However, once they get divorced, then Bet Hillel would agree that he cannot force her because they're not married anymore. These 7 things that the wife has to do is only because they are married. That's part of the responsibility of marriage. But if once they get divorced, then it's not her problem. So what about the kid? Who's going to nurse him? That would be the husband's responsibility to pay for a wet nurse. However, if the infant recognizes and knows the mother, and therefore is more comfortable to drink from the mother and not comfortable with a wet nurse, if that's the case, then the husband is still responsible, but because the baby needs the mother, he has to pay her and can force her to continue nursing, because otherwise it's dangerous. If the child is not going to want to be nursed from another woman, and then he's not going to want to eat, then he can starve to death. So therefore, she does have to continue nursing, but she has to get paid for it, because now she's no longer in the marriage, and so she's not getting anything from him, she doesn't have to give anything to him, so therefore this is a basic responsibility. So this is the ancient equivalent of child support. After a couple divorces, he is still responsible to feed his infant child. So that according to this, it looks like only Bet Hillel would say that there's an obligation for the wife to nurse, but according to Bet Shammai, she vows, she stops. And she's not obligated. No, we can say even Bet Shammai would agree with this Mishnah. We'd rather it be according to everybody. Or we're talking about a case where she vowed not to nurse, but he heard the vow and he didn't nullify it. Because he didn't nullify it, maybe it's actually his responsibility, and that's why if let's say he made the vow, I vow you will not nurse my child, I prohibit you from nursing my child. In that case, so because he made the vow, he will have to go hire a wet nurse, and even according to Bet Hillel, who says it's her responsibility, if he caused her not to be able to do it, then they remain married. It's his problem. Same as if he would vow and say, I won't get any benefit. Well, if he says, I won't, you're not allowed to make my bed or something. Okay. Bet Shammai, hu noten esba ben shineha. Bet Hillel sabre hi natena esba ben shineha. So when she makes a vow, but he doesn't nullify it, so who's responsible for that vow? Bet Shammai says he put his finger between her teeth. In other words, he could have nullified it. By not doing so, he is harming himself. The expression is, he put his finger between her teeth and she bit on it. And so he's the one that's going to suffer, even though she's the one that's biting. She's the one that made the vow, but he's the one that is responsible because he could have nullified it. Since he didn't nullify it, so therefore he can't blame her. Rather, he will have to go hire someone. Bet Hillel says she put her finger between her own teeth. She harmed herself. Maybe an expression of making a vow. Like Shakespeare says, you bite your thumb at me, some kind of curse. So anyway, she made the vow, and the fact that he did not nullify it is not important because she prohibited herself, and that's a basic responsibility. So then he can force her. So actually, that explains. Everyone agrees. Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai agrees that there is a fundamental obligation for a wife to feed her son, to nurse her children, but if she's the one that makes the vow and he doesn't nullify it, so Bet Shammai says that the Bet Hillel would say that's her responsibility, so he can force her. Whereas Bet Shammai says it's his responsibility because he didn't nullify it. So therefore, he should have nullified it. Now that he didn't, he cannot force her to nurse. Okay, if that's the answer, if they're not arguing specifically about nursing, but rather about how vows work when she makes it and he doesn't nullify it, then that would apply to anything in the ketubah. And so why not say this machloket here? Don't say it about nursing. Say if she vows about anything, the entire ketubah. So then can he force her or not? Ve'od Tanya Bet Shammai Omrim Ena Meneket. And furthermore, we have Baraita that explicitly says Bet Shammai says that a woman does not have to nurse her babies. That's not one of her basic responsibilities. So all that this answer, the attempted answer, was for naught. Rather, it's clear that this Mishnah does not follow Bet Shammai. Bet Hillel thinks that there are 7 basic obligations, including nursing, but Bet Shammai would say, no, nursing is not one of the basic obligations. The couple themselves, they have to find a way to feed the children. The man, he's in charge of the finances. He has to find a way to feed the infant child. And so if she vows not to nurse, then he'll have to find another way, according to Bet Shammai. But according to Bet Hillel, this is a basic responsibility. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.